Mike Tyson just answered a question boxing fans have asked for 30 years. Why does almost everyone who fought under Don King end up despising him? From Muhammad Ali to Larry Holmes to Tyson himself, the pattern repeats. Keep watching, because Tyson's own explanation reveals what these fighters say happened behind the scenes. Mike Tyson didn't hold back. In one of his most quoted lines about his former promoter, Tyson called him a man who found out that someone he believed was his surrogate father, his brother. His blood figure turned out to be a sellout who did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter ever in the history of boxing. Read that again. Tyson isn't just saying King ripped him off. He's saying King did more damage to black fighters than anyone in the history of the sport, white or black. That's the core of why boxing hates Don King. And it's coming from the man King built into the biggest star the sport ever had. Tyson didn't stop there. In the same breath, he went further, describing King as a wretched, slimy, reptilian motherfucker. Someone who's supposed to be his black brother, but is really just a bad man. A real bad man who would kill his own mother for $1. Ruthless, deplorable, greedy, and incapable of loving anybody. That's not a soundbite you throw out about somebody after one bad business meeting. That's the language of a man who feels betrayed at the deepest level. And it wasn't just talk. Tyson put his money where his mouth was. He filed a lawsuit seeking $100 million, and the suit alleged the promoter cheated him out of tens of millions of dollars over more than a decade. The details in that filing are what turned this from a beef into a story that shocked the boxing world. According to the complaint, Tyson was required to pay consulting fees to King's wife, son, and son-in-law, and other fees to King's daughter, who was president of the Mike Tyson fan club. And he also covered travel expenses for King and his entourage, security costs, corporate cars, renovations at King's businesses, inflated purses for other undercard fighters King promoted, and even King's own legal bills. Think about that. The heavyweight champion of the world was footing the bill for his promoter's family payroll and his promoter's lawyers. But the part of the lawsuit that really turns your stomach is what happened while Tyson was locked up. The lawsuit alleged King took advantage of Tyson's imprisonment, visiting him and persuading him to sign contracts, when he knew the boxer had no access to an attorney, with the last of those visits coming 5 days before Tyson's release. A man behind bars, without a lawyer in the room, signing away pieces of his future, to the same person now presenting himself as a father figure. The lawsuit painted a picture of total control. It claimed King had even surrounded Tyson with people who looked independent but weren't. King had allegedly surrounded the boxer with an entourage of accountants and advisors that were actually King puppets, acting in the interests of the promoter and his companies. Every layer of protection Tyson thought he had was actually reporting back to the man he was supposed to be protected from. When Tyson finally tried to break away and bring in his own people, the wall came up immediately. The true loyalties were exposed when Tyson separated himself from the King camp, and a new accountant asked Tyson's old bookkeeper for his financial records, only to be told, "I can't hand them over because the files are in cabinets owned by Don King." Tyson couldn't even get his own paperwork, the champion of the world, and he needed permission to see his own numbers. Federal filings put a dollar figure on the damage. The suit claimed Tyson had been cheated out of fair participation in deals worth more than $100 million and had been subjected to a pattern of fraudulent conduct. That was financially devastating. That's the number that made headlines everywhere, and it's the number that turned a private grudge into a public war. Now, here's the thing that makes this story so wild. King wasn't just being sued by Tyson in isolation. The very week Tyson filed, King was already headed to federal court in Manhattan on charges that he and his company had faked a contract with Lloyd's of London to collect insurance money for a canceled fight. This wasn't a one-off accusation. This was a man who had multiple fires burning at the same time, all pointing to the same pattern of behavior. Eventually, the case dragged through years of legal back and forth before it ended. Tyson agreed to drop his $100 million lawsuit against King in exchange for a $14 million payment from his former promoter. $14 million against $100 million ask tells you everything about how these settlements usually go. Promoters like King have the lawyers, the war chest, and the patience to outlast anyone who comes after them. For Tyson, the money was almost beside the point by then. What mattered was that he'd finally said out loud what fighters had been whispering for decades, that the man who built them up was the same man tearing them apart from the inside. To understand why Tyson's anger runs so deep, you have to go back before Tyson was even born into boxing. Don King's playbook with fighters didn't start with Iron Mike. It started with the biggest name the sport has ever produced, Muhammad Ali. King built his entire reputation on Ali. He staged some of the most famous events in the sport's history around him, including the legendary matchup with George Foreman and the brutal trilogy fight with Joe Frazier. Those events made King's name a household word. But behind the spectacle, the same pattern that would later define his relationship with Tyson was already playing out with Ali. In 1980, Ali took King to court. Ali sued King for underpaying him $1.2 million for a fight with Larry Holmes and ended up settling for just $50,000. Think about that gap. A man who generated more money for boxing than almost anyone in history, shortchanged by over $1 million and forced to accept pennies on the dollar just to move on. Boxing insiders have never forgotten it. One write-up on King's career put it bluntly, noting that even Ali wasn't exempt from King's tactics. He was reportedly shortchanged $1.2 million for his comeback fight against Holmes, sued, and then paid just $50,000 to drop the lawsuit. If the greatest boxer alive couldn't get a fair count from King, what chance did anyone else have? And Ali's camp knew what they were dealing with going in. According to people close to the situation, Ali's team never really trusted King, but they couldn't help admire his ambitious plans. That's the trap King set for every fighter who worked with him. The results were undeniable. The paydays were massive, but nobody around him ever fully trusted the man signing the checks. It wasn't just Ali. King's fingerprints are all over some of the ugliest business disputes in boxing history. Tim Witherspoon, a heavyweight champion who fought under King's banner, took him to court and came away with a $900,000 judgment after suing King and winning. That's a fighter proving in a court of law that he'd been cheated. Then there's Terry Norris, a former middleweight champion who accused King of even more brazen tactics. Norris sued King in 1996, alleging that King had stolen money from him and conspired with his manager to underpay him for fights. That case went the distance. Promoter Don King agreed to pay former champion Terry Norris $7.5 million, just as a jury was debating damages on the boxer's claim that King had stolen money from him, with King's own attorney predicting the settlement might encourage other fighters to sue. Even the lawyers involved understood this was bigger than one case. It was a dam about to break. Lennox Lewis, one of the most respected heavyweight champions in history, also went after King. In May of 2005, King was sued by Lennox Lewis, who wanted $385 million from the promoter, claiming King used threats to pull Tyson away from a rematch with Lewis. Even fighters who weren't directly promoted by King at the time found themselves tangled up in his business dealings. Chris Bird, a heavyweight title holder in the 2000s, had his own falling out. In early 2006, Chris Bird sued Don King for breach of contract, and the two eventually settled out of court under the condition that Bird would be released from his contract with King. Notice the pattern there. Fighters weren't even asking for the money at that point. They just wanted out. And then there's Larry Holmes, a heavyweight champion who worked with King for years and lived to describe the experience in his own blunt terms. Holmes didn't mince words when he summed up what it was like doing business with King, saying flatly that King's an equal opportunity dirtbag. He screws everybody. Coming from a man who fought for over a decade under King's promotional banner, that's about as damning an endorsement as it gets. Holmes went even further in describing exactly how King structured his stable to keep fighters trapped and broke. He explained that when Don King's fighters lose their titles, they come back fighting on the undercard for peanuts, because King owns all the top heavyweights. So they end up sparring against each other, but get charged for it, and that comes out of their own purses. Read that twice. Fighters paying out of their own pockets to spar with other fighters King also owned. It's a closed loop designed so the money always flows back to one man. Holmes also captured the reason so many fighters stayed anyway, despite knowing exactly what King was. He said it plainly, if you don't follow Don King, you get stepped on. That's not admiration. That's describing a threat. Fighters weren't loyal to King because they trusted him. They stayed because leaving felt more dangerous than staying. Even King's own defenders acknowledged how deep the accusations ran. One writer covering King's career for decades admitted that when a TV special introduced a segment on King by calling him a petty thief and numbers runner who has served time in jail for murder and has stolen money from the likes of Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson, he couldn't even push back because it was true. By the time Tyson came along in the 1980s, this wasn't uncharted territory. King had already built a track record spanning nearly every major heavyweight of the previous 2 decades, and nearly every one of them had a story about money that disappeared, contracts signed under pressure, or promises that evaporated the moment the fight was over. Tyson wasn't the exception. He was the continuation of a pattern that had been running since before he ever laced up gloves professionally. So how did a man with this kind of history end up managing the most feared fighter on the planet? The answer says a lot about how King operated and why fighters kept walking into the same trap over and over again. The relationship began almost as soon as King entered Tyson's life in 1986, when Tyson was still being managed by other people before King eventually took over. Tyson was young. He was terrifying in the ring, and he was about to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. He was exactly the kind of fighter King had built a career finding and attaching himself to. King's method was never subtle. He found fighters at their most vulnerable moments and made himself indispensable. With Ali, it was during a comeback when Ali needed the biggest stage possible. With Holmes, it was when he needed access to title shots controlled by King's connections. With Tyson, it happened during a period of chaos in the young fighter's camp, right as he was ascending to the top of the sport. Once King was in, he built structures that made it almost impossible for fighters to operate independently. Remember what Holmes said about King owning all the top heavyweights and charging fighters to spar with each other? That wasn't unique to Holmes's era. It was the same structure that boxed in Tyson years later, just with different names attached to the same playbook. King also had a well-documented history of using his influence over sanctioning bodies to control outcomes before Tyson ever arrived. One retrospective on his career described how critics accused King of not just taking money from fighters, but of manipulating title outcomes entirely, allegedly contacting a friend at the WBC to have Leon Spinks stripped of his title for refusing to defend it against one of King's own fighters, Ken Norton, who then lost the belt in his first defense to another King fighter, Larry Holmes. That's not a promoter working the business side. That's a man engineering championships to stay inside his own stable. King even built in contractual language to guarantee he'd never lose control, regardless of who won or lost. According to that same history, King would use a contractual clause requiring any fighter who beat one of his title holders to be promoted by him in future fights, meaning he retained control of title fights, no matter the outcome. It didn't matter who won in the ring. King won either way, every time, by design. This is the environment Tyson walked into as a teenager who'd grown up with almost no financial education and no one around him equipped to protect his interests. As Tyson's success grew, so did the allegations that King was financially exploiting him, taking advantage of his inexperience and lack of financial literacy. A kid who'd spent his childhood in reform schools and group homes was suddenly generating more money than most professional athletes ever see, with almost no one in his corner who wasn't somehow connected back to King. It's worth remembering just how much money was actually flowing through this operation. King's fighters weren't drawing modest crowds. Tyson fights were generating record pay-per-view numbers, and King's connections and promotional genius turned Tyson into a global phenomenon, making his fights must-see events that generated record-breaking pay-per-view numbers. The bigger the numbers got, the more there was for King's system to quietly redirect. By the early 1990s, cracks were already showing. By the early 1990s, the partnership began to unravel, with Tyson filing a lawsuit against King for financial misconduct. But the timing could not have been worse for Tyson to actually fight back. The legal battle unfolded during a turbulent time in Tyson's life, as he also faced personal issues and a conviction for rape. With Tyson facing prison, King had every opportunity to consolidate control while his fighter had no way to push back from the outside. And that's exactly what the lawsuit years later would allege happened, visits to prison, contracts signed without legal counsel present. A fighter with no leverage being maneuvered while he was at his most powerless. It's the darkest chapter of the entire relationship, and it set the stage for everything that came after Tyson walked out of prison in 1995. Tyson came home from prison in 1995, determined to rebuild, and for a while, he and King tried to keep the partnership going. But the trust was already gone, and it showed in ways that became increasingly public and increasingly ugly. Tyson was released from prison in 1995 and swiftly made his comeback to the boxing ring. And though he continued to collaborate with Don King, their partnership remained strained. Strained is putting it mildly. Behind the scenes, the $100 million question was already forming. Where had all the money gone? The final split came a few years later. In the early 2000s, Tyson officially parted ways with King, publicly stating that he had been taken advantage of for much of his career. That's the moment the private grievance became a public declaration. Tyson wasn't hinting at problems anymore. He was naming them out loud, on the record, for anyone to hear. Even after the split, even after the lawsuit, even after the eventual settlement, this beef never actually cooled off. It boiled over years later in one of the strangest scenes in modern boxing history, and it happened at a Hall of Fame event of all places, supposed to be a celebration of the sport's history. During the Boxing Hall of Fame induction in Canastota, New York, King approached Tyson to give him a playful tap on the shoulder, possibly assuming his former client had let bygones be bygones. But the former baddest man on the planet had not put the ill feelings behind him, and he responded by tossing a bit of water on King. In front of everybody, at an event meant to honor the sport both men helped build, Tyson didn't try to hide what he'd done or laugh it off as a joke. When asked about it afterward, he admitted it was real. Some assumed this wasn't a serious incident, but Tyson insisted it was, explaining afterward that what took place was filled with real animosity, while admitting he shouldn't have acted that way regardless. That's a man who's had years to cool off and still couldn't stand to be touched by the person he blames for taking his money. Tyson's own explanation of the moment says more than any lawsuit filing could. He described King approaching him and acting friendly, like nothing had ever happened between them, and Tyson wasn't having it. In his words afterward, "That was me being immature, I shouldn't have done that. But, you know, he touched me. He tapped me on my shoulder. It's just, I don't know. He talked in there like he was my friend, and that was just bullcrap." That phrase, "he talked in there like he was my friend," is the whole relationship in one sentence. The pretense of family and friendship King had sold Tyson on for years, and Tyson finally rejecting it in public, water bottle in hand. Even years earlier, when Tyson was in the middle of trying to negotiate any kind of working relationship with King again, things got physical in an even more extreme way. The two attempted a reconciliation toward the end of Tyson's career, but the negotiation did not go very well, and ended with Mike Tyson, high on cocaine at the time, kicking Don King in the head. That's how deep the anger ran, not a war of words in a courtroom, but an actual physical altercation during what was supposed to be a peace talk. This wasn't a beef that simmered quietly in legal filings. It played out in public, physically, more than once over the span of decades. Every time it looked like it might settle down, something reignited it, because the underlying issue never actually went away. Tyson never got the answers or the accountability he felt he was owed. Media figures who covered Tyson during this era saw firsthand how raw the anger stayed even years later. In one widely covered interview, journalist Dan Raphael recalled Tyson going off on a tangent about the media before circling back to his former promoter, describing how Tyson continued his diatribe, moving on to former promoter Don King, whom he had accused of stealing millions from him. Whatever the interview was supposed to be about, Tyson's mind kept returning to King, unprompted years after the money had already been settled in court. That tells you the money was never really the point by the end. The settlement checks cleared, the lawsuits closed, but the sense of betrayal Tyson carried out of that relationship stuck around long after the legal paperwork was signed, because what King allegedly took wasn't just cash. It was Tyson's trust in the people who were supposed to be protecting him during the most vulnerable stretch of his life. Time has a way of softening even the ugliest boxing beefs, and this one is no different. In the years since the water throwing incident, since the lawsuits, Since the cocaine-fueled altercation, Tyson and King's relationship has actually shown signs of quieting down, though not in a way that erases everything that came before it. When Tyson stepped into the ring against Jake Paul in a highly publicized comeback fight, King was one of the voices publicly backing him. Don King expressed his support for Mike Tyson's fight with Jake Paul, stating he had no objections to the match, and in an interview before the fight, the 93-year-old promoter emphasized his hopes that the reported $40 million payday for Tyson was accurate, saying he was glad to see them earning money and adding that Tyson had nothing to prove and should simply focus on securing the payout. That's an odd kind of full circle. The man once accused of siphoning off Tyson's earnings now publicly rooting for Tyson to collect a massive payday from someone else. Outlets covering the current state of their relationship have described it as something closer to reconciliation than open warfare. The relationship between Mike Tyson and his former promoter has shown signs of reconciliation, despite a tumultuous history, including Tyson's lawsuit alleging financial exploitation, which was settled for $14 million. Decades of anger doesn't just vanish, but two men well into their later years, with far less left to fight over, have found a version of peace that would have seemed impossible back when Tyson was tossing water in King's face at a Hall of Fame ceremony. Meanwhile, King's legal troubles never really stop. Even without Tyson in the picture, he's continued to be a magnet for lawsuits well into his 90s. Just recently, King found himself named in a lawsuit tied to an attempt to revive one of his most famous events. Don King was named in a civil lawsuit alleging fraud over a failed bid to resurrect Rumble in the Jungle 2, with plaintiffs BYD Sports and CEO Cecil Miller filing in the Southern District of New York and seeking $3 billion in damages. Even in his 90s, the same pattern that defined his entire career, big promises, big money, and eventually a courtroom, was still playing out. So where does that leave the question everybody wants answered? Why does everybody in boxing hate Don King? Tyson's own words give you the clearest answer anyone's ever put on record. It wasn't just about money disappearing, though that was a huge part of it. It was about betrayal from someone who positioned himself as family. Tyson called King a surrogate father who turned out to be, in his words, the opposite of everything that title implied. That kind of betrayal cuts different than a straightforward business dispute, and Tyson wasn't alone in that assessment. That's what makes this bigger than one fighter's grudge. Ali shortchanged and forced into a settlement pennies on the dollar. Holmes describing King as someone who screws everybody equally. Witherspoon walking away with a judgment proving in court that he'd been cheated. Norris settling for millions after alleging outright theft. Lewis going after King for hundreds of millions over alleged threats. Bird just wanting out of his contract entirely. Every single one of these men, spanning 5 decades of the sport, arrived at some version of the same conclusion Tyson did. That's the real answer to why boxing hates Don King. It's not one scandal, one lawsuit, or one bad night at a Hall of Fame ceremony. It's an entire era of fighters. From the greatest of all time down to journeyman champions, all independently landing on the same verdict about the man who built his empire on their backs. Tyson just happened to be the loudest, the angriest, and ultimately the one who said it in words nobody who heard them will ever forget.